Thank you, Terry. One more remarkable coincidence is that the Chronicle felt compelled to publish 3 huge stories about the girls, spreading this throughout the community. And a remarkable coincidence that our local labor unions felt compelled to donate to their headstone, to the memorial, collectively the largest source of cash donations, and we owe a great deal to our local labor unions for that. For the huge role in workplace safety that these girls played. We didn't know about that 100 years ago, but we know about that today. And to find out more about it, may I introduce the man who ignited that substantial labor union participation, our friend, Bob Gunther.
Well, it's my pleasure to see all of you folks here supporting labor and supporting workers. But I also would like to acknowledge that we have the leading officers of the Washington State Labor Council here with us today. Lynn Dodson, Secretary-Treasurer. Lynn, thank you. And I also would like to introduce the new president of the Washington State Labor Council, Jeff Johnson. And Jeff, would you come up and say a few words for us? And thank you again for all being here on this beautiful day.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. Thank you, John, and brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be here today to share a few thoughts with you. First off, I want to thank Bob Gunther and Pete Lamont and the Thurston Lewis Mason Central Labor Council for bringing this history back to life for the labor movement. This was a history that we had forgotten as well, so thank you so much. So as you heard from our last speaker, 100 years ago, something very tragic happened here as 8 young women, 8 young workers, the girls of Chehalis, died in an explosion at the Imperial Powder Company. And this was tragic because these young women barely had time to get a taste out of life. It was also an extraordinary event because while their deaths were needless, while their deaths were tragic, their deaths also served a purpose, no less than the 146 young women, young workers who died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911 in New York City. Their deaths as well contributed to an aggressive push in this state and around the country to form the first worker compensation laws and aggressive safety and health laws to protect workers at the workplace. Now, ironically, as John was working to refurbish this cemetery and found this gravesite, again, ironically, it came at a time in our country where once again safety and health laws were being largely ignored, and we faced tragic deaths both in the country as well as Washington State, in the form of 11 workers who died on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico at the Deepwater Horizon Company, where we faced 29 workers losing their lives in the Massey Upper Big Branch coal mine in West Virginia. And in both of those instances, safety devices had been disconnected, so workers were not warned of the impending doom. And then in our own state, just last year at the Tesoro oil refinery up in Anacortes, we lost 8 brothers and sisters, again, to a needless tragedy for which the company was fined for willful violations of safety and health laws. So what I'd like to say to you today on behalf of the Washington State Labor Council, in the name of the girls of Chehalis, in the name of the Thurston Lewis Mason Central Labor Council, we pledge to you today that we will do our best to push for the strongest health and safety laws, the strongest enforcement of those laws as we can with your help. Thank you so much. So it's my great pleasure to introduce a friend, as well as the director of the Department of Labor and Industries, Judy Schurke. We have worked with her for decades. But for the last 8 years, she has been the director of the Department of Labor and Industries, and she oversees the workers' compensation system in this state. She oversees the safety and health laws of the state and the employment standards. This woman cares passionately about making sure that our workplaces are safe and healthful for workers, for employers. With that, give a warm welcome to Judy Schurke.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Well, it's my great pleasure to be here with this celebration. I see so many labor and industries folks here. I'm glad to see my colleagues here with me. We certainly have a great interest in this event and making sure that the memories of these girls is resurrected and not forgotten. And thank you to everyone who has restored this history. I'd like to talk just a moment about worker protection, as Jeff did. In Washington, we have a long history of recognizing the need for worker protection going back as far as our 1889 state constitution, which mandated that Washington state would have laws to protect workers. We're one of the only states in the union that has such a feature in our constitution. Major safety laws were passed early in the last century, in 1903, and ironically, in 1911. But it was too little, too late to protect the girls at the Imperial Powder Company. In those days, it was common for young women to work to help to support their families. But they were typically stuck in some of the worst jobs and the worst duties in the plant, with little regard for their safety or well-being. This began to change during the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that Jeff mentioned in March 1911, when outrage swept the country and people began to demand safer workplaces and to question why those work activities and those working conditions were there for women. Here in Washington State, the Imperial Powder Company was our watershed event. It was the event that triggered outrage and anguish here. And it also had a very important function in that it tested our newly created workers' compensation system, which became effective October 1, 1911. Up until then, workplace injuries and deaths were considered just part of the job. The only relief for injured workers was through the courts. In many instances, the laws were set up to make it difficult for an injured worker to win such cases against their employers. For instance, the laws in many states prevented injured workers from recovering damages from the employer if the injury was caused by the negligence of a coworker. These challenges played out in the aftermath of the Imperial Powder Fire, when some people blamed the victims. An inquest, as you know from reading the history, ruled that the employer was not at fault, although they were fined by the Department of Labor and Industries about $1,300 for violating state child labor laws by employing 2 girls under the age of 16. Even if the families had had the resources to sue the company, it's unlikely they ever would have collected a cent. But like I said, something else happened in 1911. The mandatory no-fault industrial insurance protections for workers in hazardous industries was enacted by the legislature. All employers in those industries were required to pay insurance premiums. And I want to tell you a little bit about what happened to the families of these girls in the aftermath. The law took effect, as I said, on October 1, 1911, exactly 1 month before the fire. And the law at that time recognized that these girls worked to support their families and that the families depended on their incomes to survive. So the families of the 8 victims were awarded pensions, as they were called, of $20 a month to be paid until the girls would have reached the age of 21. The families were also paid $75 each for burial expenses, enough to cover basic funeral expenses at that time. While I'm sure the burial benefit and pensions brought some relief to these grieving families, there were challenges to the new law. The largest explosives company in the state, DuPont, refused to pay its share of insurance premiums, claiming it was not hazardous like the Imperial Powder Company was. And this meant there wasn't enough money in the new Workers' Compensation Fund to pay the pensions in the years that followed. The historical record that we looked into tells us that when there were no funds available, the department issued pension checks to the families, but also stamped them not paid due to lack of funds. A lawsuit against the DuPont company dragged on for several years, and during that time the pension checks continued to be issued insufficient funds whenever funds were not available. Now, I was relieved to learn, however, from the record that the lawsuit was finally settled. DuPont paid its share, and all of the previously issued checks were taken care of and paid to the families. The families of these girls were among the very first recipients of the new workers' compensation law, a feature of our society today that we take for granted. That money would have made a big difference to the families then, just as it does now when workers are killed at work. It's an honor for me, for Labor and Industries, to be part of the story today. One of the things I'd like to leave you with, to tag on to what Jeff and Bob said, is at the time these girls were killed, there were roughly, at the time the new law was enacted, 300 to 400 deaths a year in for workers' compensation and worker safety and health. Now there are, on average, 80 to 100 deaths a year. And granted, that is a reduction from where we were in 1911, but it is certainly not enough. And I want to ask you, when you see an article in the newspaper where a worker has been killed at work, how does that affect you? I can tell you it really affects me. Many people just go on to the sports page. But this is something that we can't accept anymore, that workers die in the course of their employment. Again, thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this ceremony and for Labor and Industries to be part of this. Thank you to everyone who has done such a wonderful job appropriately memorializing these girls. I know their families would be very, very grateful. And I thank you all for being here. I think this is just a beautiful setting and a beautiful event. Thank you.
"100 years ago, the community was in shock today. A woman wrote a poem published in a local paper about the event, and we're not going to read that poem because it was awful. But 100 years later, thanks to the hindsight of what we have seen, we now know what part these girls played. And we have another poem that is beautiful, and we will read that one here today, and we are fortunate to have the author of the poem, Bonnie Kay. Would you come forward, Bonnie, please, and share what you have written for the girls?
The girls. The 1st of November.